Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing, and where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. In this episode, I spoke with Adrian Daub about his new book, What Tech Calls Thinking, published by FSG Originals. Adrian Daub is an academic and writer and professor of comparative literature at Stanford University. We had a lively conversation on the intellectual history of Silicon Valley, and we explore tech's rhetorical strategies that have, for all purposes, disabled critical thinking and critical analysis. We touch on a number of subjects and various motifs, such as the dropping out hype, Marshall McLuhan's influence on tech and its valorization of the platform, tech and counterculture, including Esalen, the hegemonic imperative of disruption, and the fake, fail better next time trope among the Silicon Valley privileged. I hope you enjoy this episode. Okay, well, we're talking today to Adrian Daub, who is the author of a new book, What Tech Calls Thinking, an inquiry into the intellectual bedrock of Silicon Valley, published by FSG Originals in 2020, just came out recently. I found out about his book by reading a really excellent review in the New York Times. So thanks, Adrian, for joining us today. So, you're situated in the belly of the beast at Stanford University, and which has spawned many of the founders and masses of engineers in Silicon Valley. And of all things, you're a professor of comparative literature.
Yeah.
So why write a book about tech? What led you to do that? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, it was kind of a multi-stage process, honestly. I came to Stanford in 2008, in the midst of the financial crisis, and at the time when I would say sort of the current tech boom really kicked into overdrive, right? That's like the moment when nothing else, no other industry or field seemed to really harbor many promises, and suddenly you had these gleaming campuses along, 101, kind of beckoning as a potential future employer to my students, as a kind of vision of what the workplace of the future was going to look like, and as kind of the implicit ideal organization that every other organization ought to be aspiring to. So, this was the moment when academia started thinking about, hey, maybe we need to disrupt our own business model and all that kind of stuff. And as a comparatist, I was both, let's say, fairly immune to that, given that my particular skill set does not lend itself to monetization in that ecosystem, and at the same time I was really fascinated by the rhetoric that was being employed. And one of the things that really got me to eventually write the book was the very interesting conversations I had with students who wanted to work in the tech industry, but had very serious questions about how that industry justified its incredible success and its increasing chokehold on the regulatory apparatuses that ostensibly are supposed to show it some limits, and I was both. There were both moments when I was just incredibly pleased with the students that I got to talk with and who ended up going into tech, in terms of how smart and, for my money, realistic a view they took of this industry. And then there were very alarming conversations I had where students really, I felt, weren't asking the right questions, were kind of swallowing these kind of sales pitches from these companies in a way that, I sort of thought, well, it's fine for someone to pitch their product in this way. You shouldn't believe it any more than you should believe what allegedly 4 out of 5 dentists tell you is correct on your television, right? So there were moments of both. There were moments of true, of really inspiring kind of critical thinking among my students. And then there were moments especially early on, especially when tech was sort of the only game in town, of a naivete where I sort of thought, gee, my job is to teach people critical thinking. Clearly, I got to be doing that job a little differently here.
Yeah, when I first, read your book, it seems like the thrust was this kind of overall critique of the social amnesia and the historical erasure, with, as you say, with the rhetoric of Silicon Valley, this whole idea of reframing things, the hype of all the novelty, and I hear that all the time too. Is the train's left the station, everyone needs to get on board, or they'll
Right.
be left behind, and all these rhetorical strategies. What you say seems to be disabling critical thinking and critical analysis. So, in the introduction to your book, in fact, you state, I'll quote you: "It's the rhetoric of Silicon Valley may seem unprecedented, but in truth, it is steeped in some pretty long-standing American traditions, from the tent revival to the infomercial, from predestination to self-help." That was a great sentence. So what tech calls thinking often appears to be very close, in a way, to propaganda and butchered philosophy that's dressed up and jazzed up with supposedly cutting edge ideas. Is that kind of what you're saying?
So yeah,
I might be a little more crude about it, but
I think that's right. I mean, I guess propaganda is one way of putting it. The other is simply it's a sales pitch, like any other company has as well, right? I mean, of course, no company likes being regulated, right? I mean,
Right.
it's I don't know of any industries that delight in that sort of sadomasochistically. Of course, if you have investors, you want to convince them that you're the way of the future. What I think worried me in writing the book is that we're encouraged to forget that this is what these things are, and to treat these promises as genuine. and I have to say that as I was sort of going through the figures in the book that I sort of think about, sort of Peter Thiel, Mark Zuckerberg, Elizabeth Holmes, et cetera, I, in some way, got more and more angry, more at the groups and institutions in society that should be checking this kind of rhetoric and say, well, that's neat, but here's how it is, then a bit the people themselves, right? I mean, like, of course you're going to sell yourself. That's okay. What's a problem is if suddenly a politician goes around and says, having an open plan office and having everyone learn how to code is going to solve employment problems, right? And you think, that's, if I watched, the Home Shopping Network and sort of came out and said, this little gizmo that Tom Selleck sold me will make all our problems go away. Like, you're a pretty bad politician there, right? But somehow what tech sells us, because it is being sold by people with a pretty profound education and with a great deal of philosophical ambition, I think, too, right? Who have found this way of saying, well, we're not just selling you something, right? We're reframing how we think about certain things, right? It has made it harder for us as a society to sort of confront these promises with the very established and very good categories we have for testing claims like that,
Yeah, and the political implications really go unnoticed and unchallenged because of this blind acceptance, in a way.
Yeah, I think that the example of disruption is really the key one. This kind of joy taken in disruption on a purely formal level, right? Like, there are obviously things that bear disrupting. I think that if my internet service provider, who I will not name, were to be disrupted, I think my glee would know no bounds. But I think that this idea that everything that is established is by the fact that it is old, kind of illegitimate and bears disrupting, is a really destructive idea, and it often allows us to misunderstand who's holding power in a situation, right? Oh, big taxis. Like, well, that's not big taxi. These are a bunch of people barely getting by, and somehow framing it as a disruptive process. The good guy in the room is suddenly supposed to be the $50 billion company. And that's just kind of, that strikes me as deeply messed up. And more to the point, we know better, right? We know better than that. And yet that tech jargon purveyed by some of these companies, not all, but by some, can really get us to this point where the obvious is no longer obvious, and the powerful are suddenly can present themselves as weak and in need for protection, and a guy doing 16-hour shifts behind the steering wheel of a car is somehow suddenly the bad guy.
Yeah, I think another interesting point of the book, and I think it's part of your investigative approach to the subject, is this whole symbiotic nexus between these so-called thought leaders. That's a term that really gets under my skin as well. But we'll get to that later. And the symbolic heroes, like you said, with Zuckerberg, and even going back to Steve Jobs. But the symbiotic nexus between them and the media.
Yeah.
It just seems like it's a codependent relationship in terms of presenting a certain public persona or facade of what tech represents.
I agree. And one of the things that that really kind of gave me headaches in the writing of the book was, of course, it almost doesn't matter whether the attention is positive or negative. That is to say, I initially started writing about Silicon Valley for European newspapers. And so there's a really kind of interesting thing that happens when an editor from abroad asks you, can you write us a piece about this, right? Because they pick certain things and don't pick other things. And sometimes I'd have to say, like, look, I talked to my friends in tech and they say that's a nothing burger, I'm not writing this for you. But sometimes I would just, I would do the investigation, but it's kind of neat. but there are assumptions being made here that I think are ultimately maybe not tenable. And I mean, one is simply that, they want to talk about tech. They say, oh, let's call Adrian, he sits in Silicon Valley, right? Not, our colleague in Hyderabad or in Shenzhen, right? Like, this is where the future is made, right? Now, I mean, as a San Franciscan, I like to think that's true, but I doubt that it is, right? I think that this tech future is being made in a bunch of places. But this kind of fixation on Silicon Valley is, as you say, symbiotic between the companies that sit here and want that clout, and the media that don't want to put a bunch of correspondents in a bunch of places, but just have their Silicon Valley correspondent, which a lot of the German language newspapers have. Right? They often don't have one for entire countries, but they have one for Silicon Valley.
Huh.
And then similarly, right, even if these people tell very, very sort of cautionary tales about Silicon Valley, it kind of reaffirms that, like, Mark Zuckerberg is somehow omnipotent, right? Like, either he'll make everything great or he'll make everything terrible, right? Uh-huh. Like, either this disruption will get us to a point where, we're all in the promised land, or it'll make us all into zombies of some kind, right? And of course, both of these strike me as in a certain way disabling, right? Because they precisely foreclose on the notion that these are all things that we have social ways of hammering out, right? That we have that's why we have politics. That's why you have governments, right? That's why you have regulators to sort of figure out, so this is what you'd like to do. Thank you for your application. Here's what these people had to say about it. And in some way, the symbiotic relationship is almost independent independent of whether or not one thinks this is a good thing. Mm-hmm. And I was very worried about this faith that even Silicon Valley's great critics will put in Silicon Valley.
I'd like to bring up some history. You raised the name Fred Turner pops up in your book, and
a bunch.
Yeah, professor of communications at Stanford, who wrote a lot about the early days of Silicon Valley and how very different that whole intellectual landscape was and value set looked back then compared to where we are now. What do you think happened over time?
So, I mean, most of this is, I have to draw on the sense of both, sort of witnesses to history and colleagues who were there for it. Because by the time I got here in 2008, I could sort of hear the faint echoes of what had just happened. So I think one of the things that happened is that the legacy of the 1960s kind of, and the counterculture transformed. That's not to say it went away. Right. There's a little bit of a temptation to say, tech used to be dominated by these angel-headed hipsters who, came from communes and then started software companies and whatever, and and then at some point the MBAs took over. And I think Fred's great insight is to say that that's probably not the right story. That in some way there was an entrepreneurial and kind of anti-government side to the counterculture from the beginning. Yep. But that as more money came in, and frankly, as government money went out, right? As a lot of the DoD contracts that early on had sustained these companies either dried up or went somewhere else. That at that point, the mercantile aspects of the counterculture began to predominate. And I think that's already true with Apple, for instance, right? Which always sort of had this vision that was also about pretty, hard-nosed capitalist practices. But they could still do things like Steve Wozniak, funding a satellite, a beamed concert that was supposed to bring together the U.S. And the Soviet Union, and they did it at Esalen in Big Sur. So they still had these kind of countercultural moments where the idea is tech is here for everyone. It's not really a commodity. It's a way of transforming consciousness, not so that we can sell people anything, but rather for its own sake. And then I think what happened is simply a generational shift. There is a ton of money that finds these companies, and it finds them twice, right? Once in the late 90s, once in the late aughts, essentially. And at that point, we're getting to a kind of intellectual agenda that I would say is driven no longer by, it's still driven kind of by the rhetoric of the 60s and of the counterculture, but it's no longer necessarily driven by the spirit of that age. It is rather, the profits are supposed to be much more immediate, and the role of the investor is much more powerful. And it seems to me from the people I talk to in Silicon Valley that is sort of the moment when. When, for instance, the notion of creativity that subtends a lot of these professions becomes very much transformed, some might say distorted, right? In the sense that in some way risk-taking means something very, very different now, right? It's not like, we're going to try and build this product and maybe it'll be nothing, right? It's much more, let's do a pretty closely related clone to this other thing that was successful and see if we can get someone to give us $1 billion for it, right? So I think that's those are the shifts that I sort of see in the book. And then that really reaches kind of an apocalyptic level in 2008 when, to put it quite bluntly, venture capital just had nowhere else to go, right? Wherever you poured it in, like the Fed was handing out free money, and at least to banks and investment funds. The question was, where do you put this, right? Real estate is kind of dangerous, especially after the housing bubble burst. Stocks are not a good idea. Where do you put it? Well, you put it in high-risk ventures in Silicon Valley. And so that, I think, takes us essentially to the current moment or briefly before the current moment. I have a little bit of a suspicion that this is shifting again, but I'm not. I'll want to wait a little bit before opining on what I think it's shifting to. But I do think I wouldn't be surprised if in the great history of Silicon Valley to be written in 50 years, there'll be a chapter that says, 2008 to 2019 or till March 2020 would be sort of my guess.
You also bring up another name that was familiar to me, David Kelly, who was the founder of IDEO, the design firm. in Palo Alto because most management professors like myself, going back 10, 20 years ago, I used Kelly and the IDEO case study in my MBA classes.
Yeah.
And I remember I used a video of Ted Koppel had a special on IDEO where they were demonstrating this idea of design thinking and the challenge of redesigning a shopping cart at Whole Foods in Palo Alto. There was a whole segment on it. But he seems to be an important figure with his so-called D school. Why is that? And why did you cover him in the book? I'm just curious. And what significance does he have?
So, I mean, I think he matters to my story in a couple of ways. And I should say that I don't think I can cover the entire work of the D school. So I was interested in a couple of, I don't want to say ticks, but a couple of preoccupations, right? That I think design thinking forces on us, and that I have my doubts about, if I'm quite honest, right? So one is about, I find so on the one hand, I find it interesting that design thinking is possessed by the same kind of impatience with whatever exists, right? The idea of the reframe, and the idea that something can be reframed out of existence. I think that's a really interesting idea. I think it works a lot better in individual human psychology than it does if applied to, let's say, large data sets or something like that. So I think that there's a kind of an interesting question of scale there for me. The other thing that I find very interesting about design thinking there is that they that in many ways they reframe that a lot of that rhetoric uses neologisms and the rhetoric of reframing to ultimately suggest that very, very simple common sense strategies were never pursued before someone, arrived with the D school toolkit, right? I think that, that's not always true. And I'm sure there are industries where this toolkit can be very helpful, but it helps for the storytelling of the design thinker for no one to have really hit upon this idea. And I think for me, the place where I think, again, I think that there are moments when this is perfectly appropriate. The step of their 5-step program that I find this is always the most baffling to me is the empathize, right? The idea that you empathize with the customer, with the user, and I must admit that in the studies that I've looked at that use this, or the kind of examples that they will bring in their TED Talks and whatever, I'm kind of shocked by the really narrow and sort of opportunistic
instrumental
kind of attention that then goes by the name of empathy, right? And that's, I guess, my big problem with this, that I often think you give a dignity to these things that should be self-understood, and by the same time you actually misname, right? I think genuine empathy in creating some of these products would be amazing, but what goes by the name of empathy in some of these case studies really isn't deserving of that name. And it's a problem to sort of pat yourself on the back to say, we're the first people to think about the fact that there are customers on the other end of this. Like that's likely untrue. And what you're doing is not that different. And, the attention you're paying to your customers isn't that revolutionary.
Yeah. That's really interesting. You dive into another theme that's really important in the book, this kind of badge of honor in the valley of dropping out of college, namely Stanford. And the case you use is the female billionaire, Elizabeth Holmes, who was the former CEO of the biotech startup Theranos. And
I think no longer billionaire, it's safe to say.
Okay, probably not, yeah. But she was a very high-profile case of massive fraud and deception and charged by the SEC. But this dropping out thing, it's bantied around, and it goes back to Steve Jobs at Reed College and Zuckerberg and Gates at Harvard, of course. But you make note of the fact that is dropping out. First, it's not new, but it seems to be qualitatively different now in terms of what you equate to a flyby encounter with academia and education. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that and why it's so disconcerting.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things going on with dropping out, right? One is that it's actually not particularly prevalent in the tech industry, I don't think, right? I mean, or it is prevalent only among certain segments, right? Like if you think about something like Google, right? I have not met that many Googlers, but they're all exceptionally well credentialed people, right? Like there are a lot of PhDs walking around.
Yeah, they're not
campus.
hiring a lot of dropouts.
Yeah, but at the same time, the dropout has become extremely important for the perception of Silicon Valley, right? A lot of times when, and I mean, I make a couple of jokes about this in the book. A lot of times when you get an interview or a feature about a new Silicon Valley tech mogul who's like 22 years old, and you can tell that the writer really didn't know what to say about this person that would be at all interesting, right? Like they went to high school, they did half of college, they enjoy eating snacks and playing video games with their friends, right? Like suddenly they latch onto they're a dropout, as like this, like, this is finally an interesting thing that this person did, and I can sort of tell my story around this, right? And I think that's a really big part of it, this idea that maybe this education, that a formal education isn't necessary for these Silicon Valley geniuses. And the reason it troubles me is a couple of things. It's not that I think a college education is that important, even though I do think it is. I think, however, that there probably are things that you can do in terms of running a company where you don't need a college education. What I find really annoying about it is that to say that, let's say you're a Harvard dropout, right? You both take on the elitism of having gone to Harvard and the extra elitism of not having finished it.
Yeah.
Right? Oh, you were smarty enough to get into Harvard, but you're not enough of a sheep to actually take that other writing class and sit your butt down for another semester and end up with a BA, right? Like that's a really interesting kind of thing, right? Like it acts anti-elitist, but it's actually exceptionally elitist, right? Especially as Mark Zuckerberg, noted Harvard dropout, explained in his I thought very, very thoughtful Harvard commencement speech. I think it was in 2017. Of course, the person who can afford to do this, right, who can afford to take this risk, is only a certain kind of person who, so in some way, it's not an expression ultimately to drop out of a sense of risk or of a great risk taker mentality. It is essentially a reflection of your privilege, right? And I think to me the dropout was this really problematic figure in the sense that then people may have good reasons for dropping out. I don't want to deny that, but the way the media fixates on it has this way of sort of changing one thing into the other, right? Like turning elitism into anti-elitism, turning relying on privilege into independence. And I found that very, very scary. And the other reason I got interested in it, of course, is because the reason why in the Bay Area it has attained this kind of cultural cachet is because of the counterculture, right? Because we are all supposed to be these free thinkers. And when you hear a dropout, we're also thinking kind of, moving to the hate and strumming a guitar for a couple of years, joining a couple of bands and see if any of them turn out well, and then dropping acid. Yeah, go to Oregon, live on a commune for a couple of years, right? It wouldn't have this kind of cachet if it weren't for our very local, I think, lore around it out here.
So it kind of exploits that sort of cultural cachet of the Bay
Area.
Yeah,
I would say so, yeah.
And it also seems from that the new dropout sees college as a transactional experience.
I think so. At the same time, there's a funny thing. So that's always been my worry about it. And then I started writing the book and researching. And at some point I thought to myself, so like maybe it's really just that the student shows up and kind of thinks, well, it's like I'm going to a trade school or technical school. I'll get the skills I need, and then I'll go on and found my company. And then I started thinking, well, gee, what classes did Elizabeth Holmes actually take at Stanford?
Yeah.
What classes did Mark Zuckerberg actually take at Harvard? I didn't look it up. I should be very clear about that because I don't think I'm supposed to. but it's possible to reconstruct, right? The American universities tell you a lot of the courses you have to take early on, and what I came away with, which was frankly shocking to me, even though in hindsight it shouldn't have been shocking at all, is that, as anyone knows who's been to a U.S. college, you spend the first 2 years just kind of doing, I mean, sorry, but dumb prerequisites.
Yeah, general electives.
General ed, yeah.
Humanities.
You get general ed out of the way.
Yeah, a lot of humanities.
Yeah, lots of writing. So from what I can tell, someone like Elizabeth Holmes, who always sort of said, I got the training I needed out of Stanford and then I left. It's like, well, no, you didn't.
Yeah.
You took a bunch of literature classes with people kind of like me, not me, I should be clear, but people like me. Not sure if that I mean, I like my classes, but I'm not sure they predestine you to like run a biotech startup, to be honest. So it was just it's this kind of amazing thing. But of course, the one thing they do take with them are the connections, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think that this kind of these moments of ostentatious divorce from the university, like, sayonara, I'm out, basically, combined with the fact that especially the social aspects of college are often sort of maintained, right? That you often, right, Zuckerberg leaves Harvard. What does he take with him? Half of like the Facebook top brass for the first couple of years, right? As dramatized in that Aaron Sorkin movie. Now and so I think what that also often means is that in a weird way, when they leave college, they take college with them. And I think if you look at what apps have transformed around you, right? If you think about the fact that like they shop for you, they can do your laundry, they can call you a car when you're drunk, they can match you up with someone when you're lonely on a Saturday. Well, not right now, but before COVID, they could match you up with someone on a Saturday night. These are all functions of college life, right? Facebook once was the Facebook. It was once modeled after something that Zuckerberg thought was useful at Harvard for people who, were interested in dating or whatever. And like, so here's this, here it is in digital form. I do think that the way the college student or the person who is just out of college, or the person who's still kind of in college, even though they did graduate college, but in spirit they're still in kind of in college. That's in some way the ideal user for all these apps. That's the subject.
And
of
you
all
look
these
at
apps.
the headquarters of Facebook and Google. They call them campuses, right? They look like campuses.
Yeah. Right. And I mean,
cafeterias and get your dry cleaning and
you get and I mean, you get to be, I can't imagine, between let's say a bank or a law firm on the one hand and a college dorm on the other. I would say that in terms of age spread too, these companies are much closer to the college dorm. Might be a little different now, but certainly when I started writing the book in 2015-16, the age cohort was slightly older than my students, but in terms of a spread of age, my goodness, it was maybe from 22 to 28 or something like that. It could feel like a dorm. Yeah.
Yeah. And you devote a lot of time as well in your book to Marshall McLuhan.
Yeah.
And unpacking his famous quip, "The media is the message." I'm wondering, why was he relevant to understanding text thinking? And obviously, the counterculture latched onto his idea earlier. But I found that really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. So that's the line of influence that I think is hardest to prove, precisely because it goes through the counterculture. So McLuhan writes, Understanding Media and all the other really famous books that sort of become zeitgeist setting, and in the early to mid 60s, and they get very quickly taken up by the counterculture. And I think it's not surprising why they'd be interested. There's basically, McLuhan's point is ultimately that people like him, and he was a literature professor just like me, people like him had tended to overemphasize the content of media and not think enough about what their form, right? What we might call their platform does to us, right? So that's the thought that when mass literacy, for instance, right, moving from a more oral culture to a literary culture or literate culture, is not just about, oh, we used to have these stories we told each other and now we're writing them down. No, the very idea of what a human mind is, the very idea of what communication is, the very idea of what truth is,
knowledge,
all these things will get transformed as media change. And I think that's one of those ideas that in the 60s may have seemed strange, but I think we live that truth every day. And like literally every time I turn on a new app or something like that, I think, okay, Marshall, you're right yet again, you jerk. So there is he saw this very clearly, but his big influence, I think, on the counterculture was that ultimately he didn't think this was a bad thing. Yeah. He thought this was ultimately inevitable, and I think it's fascinating that the counterculture very quickly understood why that was good, because, right, if you think about yourself being kind of a lefty kind of intellectual in the mid 60s, and you're trying to sort of tell people that, like, consumerism is bad, this kind of the kind of bland conformism of the 50s is bad, and people say, oh, that's cool, and then they go back to their subdivisions and drive their 1.5 cars into their 2-car garage or whatever, right? The idea that, well, we're not going to convince these people on the content, but maybe we don't have to. Maybe the media will ultimately reframe the consciousness as such, and maybe that's the revolution we really need. So it's not shocking to me that they found this pretty cool and pretty interesting. And then I don't think it's a surprise that the counterculture, that the tech industry took this idea from there, right? Because the idea was they were by and large not building things that people said, like, oh, that's what we need, right? It was often sort of getting people to absorb into their lives something that they had not previously known they needed. I mean, listeners of yours who are old enough to remember their first smartphone, right? Like, there was often that moment before you buy your first smartphone, you think, why do I need this thing? And then 6 months later, you will never ask yourself that question again, because it's become, as Marshall McLuhan put it, an extension of yourself. Suddenly you've become reliant on it.
One of the, I like to continue this a bit, but I think one of the bugs, if we want to use that term, about what tech calls thinking is this kind of shorthand appropriation of certain bits and bytes of a philosopher or a seminal thinker. And they sort of like distort it and repurpose it for their own narrow interest. And maybe that's not so much with McLuhan, but and McLuhan, if I understand you, he wasn't the clearest writer. I mean, I guess his writing was not exactly that clear.
No, he was a very elusive, very erudite too, which is not always a great thing when you're trying to, and these were very weighty ideas he was trying to express. There would have been real value in trimming that down. So I think that's true, and I think that tech essentially, I think, for our purposes today, grabbed 2 ideas from McLuhan, one of which he believed, the other one of which I think he didn't actually believe. One idea that they draw from him is this kind of tech determinism.
Yeah.
His ideas are ultimately fairly deterministic. He's not the kind of person who says, tech is changing who we are, right? Which a lot of people would agree with, but then follow it up with, and that's terrible. He says it's inevitable. It just happens. And his books can read as frankly fairly callous, as he consigns entire professions to the dustbin in a way that frankly we are all too familiar with, because like that's what tech does now. And so I think tech, and he also says, like, there's no blaming anyone for these things. Now, we might say that, like, yes, when it comes to printing books, it's like, well, gee, no one's going to go back and tell Gutenberg, like, why did you do this, right? Like, it is what it is. It's a little bit different when there's a billionaire making a lot of money on it. Like, we think that we'd have a little bit more control over it. But so there's this is kind of very easy determinism that he slips into, and that's probably more about history than it is about the future. The other thing that I don't think he actually believed, but that tech takes out of it, is he had this methodological distinction. He said, look, there's something deeply naive and blinkered about constantly focusing on the content, right? Oh, these TV shows are very dumb. They're making people dumber. It's like, no, it's not about what the content is. It is about what TV as a medium does, and that's interesting. And just being annoyed at I Love Lucy is a stupid thing to get distracted by. He meant that sort of as an intervention. He wanted to sort of say to his colleagues, people like me, you're looking at the wrong thing. Please pay attention differently. But I think what tech grew out of that is the idea that the content is ultimately not the point. That the true structure of our media reality is what we today call the platform. And I think that has had very serious repercussions for how let's say, the responsibility for content is distributed in Silicon Valley. Think of Section 230, right, of the Communications Decency Act. How labor is valued in Silicon Valley. Namely, the closer you work to the platform, the better. The more content you create, the worse for you. Getting paid for content is very, very hard.
And you say that's a gendered. You see that as a gendered phenomena as well. The people.
Absolutely. Absolutely, it's definitely true that the more someone, it's true as an empirical fact that the gender composition within tech industry, within tech companies tends to be most lopsided the more they work, behind the scenes, the more they work, the more they work on the code, the more they work or the less they work on the front end, basically. Mm-hmm. Similarly, it's true that a lot of the content provisions that aren't remunerated at all, like people who aren't even officially employed by the company, tend to skew female. The example I give in the book that always I find very striking is that Yelp very clearly understood itself in the beginning. It was an overwhelmingly male company. Understood itself as catering, as drawing on the work of women to fill its reviews. Early rewards programs in Yelp, and I don't know if that's still the case, but the people I talked to were there at the beginning, and they said, no, it was we were giving people spa weekends and mani-pedis. We very much envisioned clearly a woman writing these reviews and not getting compensated for it, right? Because she was not working for us. So I think that it's heavily gendered, and the other way it's gendered is that McLuhan kind of showed that this attention to he positioned this kind of attention to the form, the true structure of reality, as essentially a style of masculinity, a style of ordering, penetrative, and kind of organizing masculinity of this plethora, right? If you think about what he was ultimately doing, is he was analyzing, ads, analyzing jingles, analyzing comics, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of them, a lot of material targeted at and featuring women. But that was supposed to be the illusion. You were supposed to see beyond that. And so he also sort of the true analysis he positioned as a kind of style of masculinity. And I think that's pretty important too.
Yeah, so the tech industry, it valorizes the platform, plays down its responsibility for content. But when it comes to media ethics, given what we've seen in the last decade or even the last 4 or 5 years with tribalism and the repository of conspiracy theories,
right,
breeding ground now for domestic terrorism, how do people like Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey, how do you think they rationalize this? Especially, there was a recent Senate hearing, I think, of all people, Lindsey Graham was convening about the reform of the 1996 Communications Act, and I happened to tune into a little bit of it, and I saw Lindsey Graham pose a question to Zuckerberg, asking him, "Are these platforms addictive?" And he said, "No."
I didn't see that part. I saw the parts where they were all complaining about being shadow banned from Twitter or something. But oh wow, that's that's a bald-faced lie, and that's really impressive.
Yeah, I know. But so this is the whole idea of this idea of the medium. The platform is the medium, and so therefore, we're off the hook. Is that basically the stance that?
Yeah, and the platform is in some way it's A, neutral, it's B, it is what it is. It is also it doesn't have its values, which is obviously untrue, right? We know exactly what kind of content gets mostly shared on Facebook, what gets most engagement, right? Um, and it does tend towards not necessarily fake information, but definitely the one that will get an emotional response, right? That's a that prejudges what ends up being what this platform mostly ends up being used for. And I would say that there's also, of course, this a tendency to and the other thing that the platform does, I think that or in their mind, they take that from McLuhan to some extent, is that it is ultimately there's ultimately a kind of purity to it, right? That you can sort of abstract it from its contents, and I talk about this a little bit in the book when it comes to the way these companies think about the concept of communication, right? Where they always sort of seem to suggest, oh, we built this beautiful thing for you, but you people only use it to send each other naughty pics and troll the hell out of each other and to share horrifying memes and to share fake news. If only you understood what we had built for you here, right? And I think that is a little bit of a McLuhan legacy, but I think it goes further back. Or it has other roots also in the counterculture of just this idea that communication could be this pure thing, but actual communication will always fall short of it. And you kind of blame the actual communication as opposed to say, well, if no one ever uses this thing for anything but trolling each other, maybe there's something in the design here that's a problem, right? As opposed to it's an agora, it's a public space, it's a public square. It is the Socratic wonder of it's a Platonic Academy or whatever. It's like, no, it's not. That gentleman took a picture of his junk and sent it to that reporter. I think that's the sense of disappointment that allows you to not grapple with the reality of these platforms is, I think, this kind of purism is something that I find very, very troubling. Because precisely in a kind of McLuhan-esque gesture, it kind of retreats into abstraction precisely when it should say, like, nah, that was not great. Here's how we propose to make this better, right?
Yeah, you have a really good take on trolling in the book, and I like your quote about the troll. You say the troll is a cynic who represses the fact that he is a cynic.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I found very, very and I should say there's of course a gendered aspect to that as well. I had to learn about trolling essentially. I mean, I've been trolled a little bit, but I basically went through I ended up just kind of following women reporters who get trolled a whole lot, and just kind of really clicking my way through these excruciating torrents of abuse that would sort of come their way, and I was really what it impressed on me very starkly is that the troll does not abuse the communication platform like Twitter. The troll in some way uses the communication platform exactly in the way it is intended, and that's a problem, right? But that is why a lot of these companies, I think, don't really grapple with this problem to the extent that they should, because it's ultimately it raises some really uncomfortable questions for them. It really gets you to a point where you have to say, no, this person is not, playing the piano with their elbows. This person is playing the instrument the way it's meant to be. And what does it say about an instrument if it's meant to be played this way?
Yeah. I'm a big fan of Mark Fisher as well. I know you mentioned him in the book.
Yeah.
And you pick up on his notion of gestural politics. And you use some examples from some Disney and Pixar films.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that also kind of tying into this whole idea of being a keyboard warrior on Twitter?
Interesting. Yeah, there might be something like that. That's right. I think a lot of Mark Fisher's work that has really resonated with me is he talks about this gestural anti-capitalism of Pixar, right? And the idea of the gesture became really kind of important to me in the sense that there really are around the tech sphere a lot of things that really where gesture is really the only way to describe it. That is to say, what I mean by that is simply they pretend that they look in every conceivable way like they're doing A, but if you think through it, it's really hard to say in what way they're actually supposed to be doing A, and you have a suspicion that they're actually doing B, right? And Disney kind of constantly lecturing, their viewers who have just plopped down $15 to see the latest Pixar movie on the evils of capitalist conformism. I'm like, that's pretty freaking rich there, But there are many of these ways, right? Like the way Ayn Rand allows a lot of these tech CEOs to present themselves as victims. When you're like, well, if you think about it for a microsecond, you're like, well, what are you the victim of? Some people were mean to you on Twitter. As far as I can tell, you are as rich, if not slightly richer than you were when they started doing that.
Yeah, Elon Musk, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's also this kind of idea of, right, the way that they position themselves as independent thinkers and yet often sound so alike, right? A lot of these VCs who kind of sort of hold up, they're like, well, I surround myself with fellow apostates and people who sort of think dangerous and unusual ideas. Like, but all your friends have the same unusual ideas. Yeah. Isn't that just called being part of a milieu? And these are your ideas. There's a essay by Paul Graham that recently came out. I think it's called something like "How to Think for Yourself" or something like that, or "How to Think Independently," which I think gets at that very interestingly, and I don't think very well, frankly, because he precisely sort of says, I try to surround myself by people who are different from me, and then he thanks, which I applaud. He thanks a lot of people that he showed the essay to before he sent it out, and it seems to be mostly like other wealthy investors in Silicon Valley, and like all from his area code. And you kind of think like, gee, this is, or from Silicon Valley area code. I guess Paul doesn't actually live here, but it's an interesting example of like of the gesture. Right, the gesture is of independence. If you look closely, what it really resembles more is that, well, people like you have this kind of opinion and you have it also. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's odd to reframe that as somehow independent thinking.
Yeah, I see some similarities too with, for example, the yoga and the mindfulness industries, which engage in this what you call do-good discourses. Where you're buying certain products or brands, and mindfulness is kind of a brand. It's a spiritual commodity, but it gestures that you're sending signals of activism, but without having any real boots on the ground or any real bodies on the ground.
Yeah, I think that's. I think that. You know much more about the mindfulness industrial complex than I do, but I've never, especially knowing your work, it's never been shocking to me that mindfulness and the tech industry often go hand in hand.
Oh yeah.
There's a real that they would obviously feel a certain amount of sympathy for that kind of discourse. And I think you're putting your finger on one way in which those two are really related, which is that they allow you to feel like a dissident when you're not. They allow you to feel like you're being active when you're not. They allow you to feel like you're a risk taker when you're not. The fact that that's easy to sell is not surprising. We all like our risk not real, right? I mean, it's nice to think you're taking a risk when you can actually feel perfectly secure.
Yeah.
Or you're having dangerous ideas when they're indeed ideas that everyone around you subscribes to. So I think that strikes me as very accurate, as a very kind of as ideological co-formations, maybe.
Yeah, well, the mindfulness movement is there has been sociological research by Jamie Kusinkis, I can never pronounce her last name, did a really fantastic study seeing it as a white, privileged, elite movement. It's not a social movement the way we usually think of social movements. But I'd like to go back to the counterculture and talk a bit about Esalen. I'm really happy you included Esalen in your investigation, and we can't talk about Silicon Valley without understanding the enormous influence Esalen has. It's been a hotbed of countercultural ideas and the human potential movement. And I didn't know that the co-founders, Dick Price and Michael Murphy, were both Stanford grads. I didn't know that. Yeah. I think they were both trust fund babies as well.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah, I think it was Dick Price's grandmother who owned that land.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I read that somewhere recently. But just think of all the luminaries that came through that place in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, no kidding.
Aldous Huxley and Abe Maslow and Gregory Bateson, Stan Groff, Fritz Perls, John Lilly, Ken Kesey, Buckminster Fuller, Joseph Campbell, on and on. But Esalen, I've taken a look at their catalog and off and on, and it ain't what it used to be in terms of, affordability for one thing.
Right.
It's obviously been taken over by Silicon Valley techies. And but on the other hand, you also, as you said earlier, that it's always had ties to technology too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is not. It is not a hostile takeover by any means. In some way, the human potential movement and others like it kind of were very much interested in technology. We're interested in the expansion of consciousness that could be brought about by technology. And they were never, right, as the list of luminaries suggests, right, they were not just hippies. They were not just sort of making their own shirts out of human hair or something. Not to diss hippies, but they were not a prototypical hippie commune. They were very much looking to change society by changing human consciousness. And they were, and they always knew they always had a view towards transforming the broader society. Isolation was never the name of the game there, unlike in some countercultural institutions in the far north of California, right? So I think that's really, really important that the forces that Esalen is now, I would say to some extent, falling victim to, are ones that Esalen itself unleashed, and I think could not but have unleashed. It was just a very, it was this incubator for a lot of these ideas, and in the book I cite the example of Aldous Huxley's, drug experimentations that, of course, eventually would bring him to Big Sur. But what's interesting about that is, of course, the way he talks about mescaline and things like that. It does sound like the promises of the tech industry to some extent, right? Like he's like, I can see through the eyes of this artist. I can fully understand the mind of Bach. I can write like these. If you look at the way Google sort of position, what's that called? Google Arts and Culture, the one where you can zoom in on famous paintings to an extent that you could never if you were at the Louvre. We would never let you go close enough, but there you can do it, right? Like these are in some way, right? Like on the one hand, a lot of the things that tech allows us are in some way like drug trips, and on the other hand, what Huxley seems to have looked for in drug trips is a lot like what the internet allows for us, right? Like, what if I could be one with 1 million strangers? So there is I think that their interest in technology was part of a broader interest, but I would say that we also have to think of some of their other preoccupations, above all the drugs, as a kind of technologist's interest to begin with, and not in the sort of modern microdosing Silicon Valley way, but in a way that really kind of anticipates a lot of the technologies that we take to be determinative of our age.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to come back to talking about disruption again, and it kind of reminds me. I mean, it's obviously another overused and irritating buzzword. And you devote a whole chapter to it. But it reminds me how tech claims to have disrupted a Buddhist wisdom tradition by launching its silly tent revival and snake oil conference, which was called Wisdom 2.0. It's a conference that's held every year in San Francisco by pretty much the tech giants. So I really kind of resonated with that. But disruption has a really interesting intellectual history that perhaps you can speak to here. But before we get to that, what's really problematic about this term when it comes to capitalism in Silicon Valley? Because I think there's a lot of interesting history that you dive into. Joseph Schumpeter's notion of creative destruction and Marx and Engels' genealogy of disruption.
Yeah, so I think the biggest problem with the discourse of disruption, or with the buzzword, is that it's one size fits all, right? That wherever we are, whatever the industry is, disruption can be used to explain what's going on, whether or not it fits, right? And it tends to make certain assumptions that I think were far more defensible when people first coined this, right? I mean, so there's a funny way. The only other people I could find that used not the term disruption, but a similar term, with as much breadth as Silicon Valley likes to, were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So they really think that that capitalism consists of the constant, disruption of all that exists, and they think that this ultimately makes it unsustainable, right? And will lead to revolution. They're the only ones who really are this global about, like, everything's being disrupted. Well, and I think that some faint echo of that still, this kind of sublimated revolution, is still behind the way the term is used in the Valley today. But then Joseph Schumpeter restricts the term a lot. Schumpeter is a thinker of the business cycle. He thinks this is true for companies who are in the same markets and competing on essentially a level playing field, right? And his point against Marx and Engels is to say, no, because of creative destruction, this is his word, because of creative destruction, there doesn't have to be, monopoly capitalism will never be fully realized, because there will always be someone who just flips over the game board and sort of tries to show that you can do something totally different, right? That's the disruptor. That's the creative destroyer. And because of that, we're not going to see a revolution. He does also think that that's on the whole so discombobulating for individual humans that they're likely to vote for very severe regulation of the business cycle, and therefore for something like a socialist government in the long run. Which he didn't love that idea, but he thought this, writing this during the New Deal, he's thinking, yeah, this is where we're getting. We're going to get the New Deal forever, basically. That's sort of where Schumpeter comes down. And then in the 1980s, disruption becomes really, really important, and starts to be a little one-size-fits-all. But really, when it comes to companies being taken over by by essentially hedge funds, right, or by right by finance conglomerates, which is still a kind of a kind of narrowing, right, vis-a-vis Marx and Engels. Marx and Engels thought this is true for the grocer around the corner, right, the mom and pop shop. This is as true for your local video store as it is for Blockbuster Video, right? In the 80s, that's not how it was used. It was used to say large companies that someone on Wall Street would actually bother to take over, right? By the time we get to Silicon Valley's cult of disruption, they kind of draft into gladiatorial combat people who had no idea they were ever entering an arena, right? They thought they were running a laundromat, one of them, on Divisadero Street in San Francisco. Oh no, but they're not. They're actually Big Laundry, part of Big Laundry, and now comes a new startup that will disrupt the laundry space, you know? And that is something that is ultimately new in this discourse, but ultimately harkens back to the way that's what Marx and Engels thought was happening, right? This kind of global and constant shaking up of everything that exists. So that it has gone through these very interesting changes, and the number one change is precisely whether it's one size fits all or whether it describes a subset of the economy.
Yeah, it's like a hegemonic sort of imperative ideology that do or die. I mean, it's...
Yeah, that's right. It tells a story of the danger of doing what you've always done. It's a parable about the dangers of tradition, right? You keep going and keep doing what's always worked for you until one morning you wake up and it doesn't work for you anymore, right? and that way it expresses a very profound experience of modernity of ours, right? Which is precisely that like you do the same thing long enough, and you know you find yourself being yesterday's news.
Yeah, and you characterize it as sort of as high drama.
Yeah,
a lot of hype and hoopla over nothing, but the consequences, as you.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think it's a hype and hoopla over something. It's just not the thing that the hype and hoopla is about. I mean, I think ultimately it's horrible for a lot of people, right? It's often, but the weird thing that especially I think since the 80s is true is that we're supposed to cheer it. We're supposed to say,
right,
you know, they're morality plays, right? This company didn't move fast enough. This laundromat did not move fast enough, and now it deserves to be put out of business. And you think, well, this is just a family. It doesn't have its livelihood anymore. I don't quite see how that's a morality play, you know?
Yeah, another stupid trope that really pisses me off that you use in the book is move fast and break things.
Oh God, yes, yeah.
That's another reason why I really don't identify myself as being a business professor, even though I'm situated in a business school.
Yeah, it's and I mean there may well be fields where I think this is probably true, possibly. The problem is exactly this idea that this needs to be expanded, this almost missionary zeal with which it is carried into every field, and in which there is a kind of moralization there, isn't there? Of like, you know, well, you didn't work fast enough, you didn't break enough things, you weren't bold, you know, and you think, what a dystopian kind of thing to force on human beings.
Yeah, I hear that in my field all the time. It's change is inevitable, so you got to learn how to surf the waves. You know.
Yeah. God. Yeah.
Another nauseating mantra is techs fail better next time.
Oh yeah.
You have a chapter on that about. It seems like, well, if you're white, rich, and privileged, you know, maybe you can say that. So tell us the story about this this conference called FailCon.
Yeah, so I interviewed Cass Phillips, who first founded this event that I've honestly never been to because it was gone by the time I became aware of it.
Did it fail?
It failed. It failed by being too successful. People got too successful, so they had to. I think it still exists in other places, but basically they decided in San Francisco it had become deeply kind of colonized by tech culture. And I found that very interesting, the way, so I mean, on the one hand, this idea of failing, of failure being okay, being part of any path, is such a beautiful one. I think it's really, really important. But it's therefore, it made me all the angrier to sort of think about how that's usually used in the tech industry, which is, as you say, it really pretends to be a universal, but it hides really nasty kind of particularism. That is to say, who you are matters so much in terms of whether you can get to fail better, right? Are you the CEO of a company, or are you the person who was brought on at the last minute as the receptionist? Are you someone who VCs want to throw money at again after the first thing you did kind of seemed semi-fraudulent or whatever, right? And like we all know that that's often tied up with questions of race and gender in really uncomfortable ways, in that women of color find it very hard to get funding in the Valley. But it also, and I say this as someone who wrote this book while I was getting older, and my students were kind of staying the same age. It's also just like they're creaturely facts, right? Failing better and failing again is something you can tell a 25-year-old. It's a shitty thing to hear when you're 50. It's a shitty thing to hear even when it's a shitty thing when you have to go home to a family and look at them and be like, well, we don't know where the money's coming from, but trust me, I'm going to fail better next time, right? One of the privileges it trades on is just time of life, just not having responsibilities. And I do think that it's wonderful if you have that, right? Make all the use of the runway that you've got. I get it. It's weird when that's being held up as some kind of generalizable wisdom, right? And especially in a country, in a society, and in an economic system where for many people, one failure,
right.
Forget failure,
right.
When one slight misstep can be the end of a life, right? When one bad medical diagnosis, when one kind of boneheaded financial decision, when one factory closure can be all that stands between you and the utter abyss. To ask, failure, where is thy sting? That's damn near cynical, I think. Now, if they could expand this somehow and make, if coal miners got to fail better, I'd be all for it. But that's not what they mean. That's not how this is set up. It really kind of, and it makes a mockery of how finalized, or how final failure has become for so many in this economy.
Yeah, and you also bring up this idea of this whole ethos of self-help and the whole self-optimization narrative that.
Oh yeah.
Which I definitely know what you're concerned about there. Mindfulness has a very similar mode of address in terms of focusing on individual salvation. And but you bring up somebody quite interesting that I didn't expect, Richard Bandler, who was one of the pioneers in neuro-linguistic programming, NLP, which is a pseudoscience of sorts. But I don't know if you know this, but he was a heavy cocaine user.
I did not know this.
And get this, he was charged with murder of a prostitute.
I think I read about this.
He eventually was found not guilty, but some shady associations there.
My goodness, yeah. I think I looked this up and I was like, what if it's not the same guy? I want to be careful not to put that in the book, but it is the same guy. You can confirm this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think for me, the way in which NLP is only one example of a bunch of formations that ultimately translate self-help bromides into a kind of discourse or a jargon that's meant to apply to large collectives. And I think I'm very fascinated by the way that happens, because I think there's obviously something very problematic about that, about the way in which the collective nature of a lot of these companies, a lot of these undertakings, is deliberately repressed when we think about when we use the vocabulary of self-help. Now, I've got nothing against helping myself. I think that it's good to work on oneself. At the same time, it is a weird move to kind of analogize a corporation to the self, right? I mean, I guess Mitt Romney does it, but I think that that generally, in that respect, corporations are not people, and that we need to be very, very careful, right? This is a good example, I think, for where I see the limits of some of that rhetoric of design thinking, which frankly also frequently traffics in self-help tropes, which is that a lot of the tropes are supposed to help you, the person going through the process, right? Which just makes things like empathy very, very tricky. It's like, well, if I am the ultimate target of this process, what is it that I'm empathetic with, right? Isn't this a moment of, am I not actually erasing the very person that this object is supposed to be there for, right? I think that there are really tricky bits there where this very ease with which Northern California moves from self-help to here's how you should set up larger collectives. And some of that might well come out of the counterculture. I can't swear to it, but I mean, it seems to me that that's, right? Oh, meditation is good for me individually, so let's do group meditation, right? Like that kind of idea. But I don't know if it's originally from there, but I do think that that's really important, right? That ultimately the ease with which self-help gets transmuted into advice for larger groups is kind of a problem.
Well, and it also perpetuates the individualizing with our social and collective problems too, by using that same sort of language and discourse.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the one thinker we haven't talked much about, but that I talk a bit about in the book is Ayn Rand, right? Where it's this funny thing where, if you read Ayn Rand's novels, she treats the corporation essentially as the artwork of the person who founded it, or the person who created it, or the person who's running it, or whatever. In spite of the fact that obviously, especially the corporations she's talking about, right, architecture firms, railway companies, like, are famously collective enterprises, right? Like, it's not. This is not like someone making a painting or something like that, right? These are massive conglomerates. But of course, so on the one hand, we might say, oh, that's a bit of fantasy, and maybe that's why Silicon Valley CEOs are drawn to Ayn Rand. But then I sort of thought, well, gee, what is Elon Musk if not someone who's trying to be a painter but with corporations, right? Like, none of this stuff makes any kind of coherent sense. It seems to be whatever, like, is a bee in his bonnet at the moment, and it all is bound up with his kind of very particular energy. He really has sort of created something that is between a company and performance art. So in some weird way, Silicon Valley, in extreme cases, is actually creating the very kind of category errors of which I accuse them of. Right? I don't think that makes. I think that makes working for that kind of a person, that kind of company, kind of a nightmare, frankly. But it's a really interesting thing that, like, in some way, the animating fantasy behind it, as outlandish as it is almost coming true in some of these companies.
Yeah, that reminds me of the myth of the lone genius in a way, because that gives them sort of license to be assholes too.
Exactly. I mean, and again, very, very gendered, right? The idea that Anna Wiener in her wonderful memoir Uncanny Valley talks about this a little bit, about how it's a kind of she doesn't describe it quite in those terms, but she essentially says this kind of lone, incommunicative, and maybe kind of asshole-ish genius puts all of us in kind of a care position, in the sense that we have to react to their tantrums.
Yeah, we become...
we all have to kind of adjust. We have to distort in order to adjust to the distortion that they are.
Right, we become the acolytes. We have to kind of tiptoe around and walk on eggshells for the narcissist so he doesn't, like, blow up and... Yeah.
Yeah, or smooth the edges for the investors, or or pay out the employee after what has transpired is obviously a violation of the law, right? All these things.
Clean up the mess. Clean up the mess.
Clean up the mess, right? Like, and I think that in the book I cite the farewell message that Travis Kalanick posted after he quit as CEO of Uber, I believe, saying basically, I have a lot of growing up to do. He was 39 years old at the time, right? And that's the other thing. It puts a bunch of people in kind of parental positions, like usually as mommy figures, while certain people get to live out essentially an eternal adolescence.
Peter Pan.
And I think, and I think Elon Musk, I don't know how old is he now, but like,
gotta be in his 40s.
Too old. Yeah, too old to be acting like that, And so there's something where it's almost like this kind of distortion of this persona, as you describe it, kind of forces everyone else to adjust their own labor and and their own disposition, right? Like, you can't have two Elon Musks in a room; it's just not going to work.
Yeah, that would be a horror movie.
Yeah, dueling rockets.
Well, Adrian, this was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I hope everyone can take a look at your book, What Tech Calls Thinking. It's a great book, and it was great talking to you.
Thank you, Ron. It was great talking to you, and thank you for all your work around this topic as well.
Okay.